Good morning and welcome to panel 3. How can non-standard workers be protected against the economic risks of unemployment? And I am Dutta-Gupta. I'm co-executive director of the Georgetown Center on Poverty and Inequality. I'm also a recent board member of NASI. I joined with my friend Jason Fichtner just a few months ago, who's back there. I'm excited. I think we have a phenomenal lineup. We're going to catch up a little bit on time by going quickly, but we're going to have time for questions at the end here. So let me just tell you a little about what we're going to discuss and then introduce the panelists. So I think the focus is really how can we protect against unemployment, to some extent underemployment, which I think is sort of an important and useful distinction here. How do we do that now? What should we be doing to do that better going forward? What changes are within reach? You're going to hear some ideas that are arguably sort of tweaks, but then also what changes are more ambitious, and some ideas I think that you'll hear will take a lot of thinking and building consensus. So let me start with a brief introduction. So we have Stephen Wandner here. He's a senior fellow at NASI and a visiting fellow at the Urban Institute and a research fellow at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. And like me, whether you realize it or not, many of you have relied upon this research on public programs and labor market probably for your entire careers. And then we have Andy Stettner here, who's a senior fellow at the Century Foundation. And having worked closely with him during the Great Recession, I can personally attest to the fact that he was as responsible as anyone for some of the unprecedented expansions of unemployment insurance during those years. And then we have Rachel West, who's an associate director of the Poverty to Prosperity program at the Center for American Progress. And I worked very closely with her on some of the research we'll be talking about. And she's as creative of a thinker as she is a careful researcher and analyst. And at this point, even having worked on unemployment insurance for over a decade, she is my go-to for all questions related to UI. So you have an excellent lineup. There are full bios in your conference folders. And remember to use the question cards on your tables to write down your questions, and Alexandra or someone else will pick them up and bring them to me after the speakers are finished with their opening remarks. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephen.
Good morning. My topic, as you can see, is unemployment insurance adapting to a changing labor force. And my thesis is that it hasn't done very much of a job in doing so, and that the problem is really more than standard versus non-standard work. We really have to deal with them all together. And that's largely because of the fact that the program really has had only a limited ability to adapt to change. It's a program like all the other social insurance programs, started in 1935. It has not evolved as much as it should have. And that's really, I think, because of three issues, one of which is the fact that there's been no major welfare reform, unemployment insurance reform nationally since 1976. That could be somewhat ameliorated by the fact that it's a federal state program. The states could have done a great deal more, but they really have done not as much as they could, and what they've done is really quite uneven. And finally, employers pay the tax for UI, and they have been resistant to benefit changes and tax changes. So what's happened is that there's been some adaptation to change with respect to eligibility by individuals as part of the changing labor force, but it's been uneven, and coverage for the non-standard workers has not taken place. I'll leave most of the solutions to Andy and Rachel, but I've got one last slide that I hope I can get to. Okay, I've jumped ahead. Essentially, what's happened is that there has been a change in labor force, as we all know, and to a great extent, the unemployment insurance system has either partially adjusted or not been able to adjust as well as it can with respect to increases in labor force participation by women and older workers, multiple house earners in households, part-time work, the changing nature of older workers, and the fact that with permanent displacement increasing greatly since the 1970s, unemployment insurance recipients really need a lot more reemployment services than they needed prior to that period. What we have is a constrained system. Because of lack of federal and state legislation, we have a federal taxable wage base of $7,000. It has not changed since 1983. This is not an adapting system, and it's well to keep in mind that when the Social Security system first began, Social Security, pensions, and UI had the same taxable wage base, and we see what has happened. The states can increase their taxable wage bases, but mostly they haven't done very much. And my example is that there are 16 states that still have taxable wage bases of less than $10,000. The UI tax is very low. It's less than 1% on total wages. But with a constrained financing system, we have a constrained benefit system as well. The recipiency rate last year was 26%. 26% of all unemployed collect unemployment insurance. That's about as low as it's been ever. It can't be 100%, but for a long period of time, it was in the 40s. The replacement rate, the average benefit as a percentage of the average weekly wage is down now at 33%. It's well to keep in mind that in the dark ages of the Truman and Eisenhower administration, both presidents said that that rate should be 67%. And furthermore, the last example is potential durations of benefits were 26 weeks or more in all states for about 40 years. In a book we did on unemployment insurance in 1995, we said this is the American consensus. Well, the consensus is gone. We are now up to 8 states with benefits of less than 26 weeks. There's wide variation in what this program looks like, and here I've contrasted Massachusetts and Florida, and you can see that the recipiency rate is low nationally, but it varies very greatly, as does potential duration. Florida has the lowest potential duration, and Massachusetts is one of the few states with more than 26 weeks. Wage replacement, as well as the taxable wage rate, and the average tax on total benefits also varies a great deal. So we have very different programs in different states. But that also means that the states have adapted unevenly to changes in the labor force. And here I just give a few examples on the benefit side of the fact that in most states, but certainly not all states, if you were a part-time worker and you're searching for work, only a little more than half the states allow you to search for part-time work and still collect unemployment insurance. Following a spouse, when it's impractical to commute, we've got about half the states there. With respect to alternative base periods, which is considering more recent wages to determine whether you're eligible or not, we've got most states, but not all states. And with respect to reemployment services, states have been quite uneven. We're now up to 28 states with work-sharing programs, but it's been painful to get there, and I don't think we're going much further. Self-employment programs are very small. Looking quickly at self-employment, self-employment is an important issue, but states have not figured out how to cover self-employment. California had a self-employment eligibility program on the books. It's no longer there. States have not really figured out how to make that happen. But by contrast, and this is a program I was deeply involved in, self-employment assistance is a way of trying to help people to get back to work, to tell them that, no, you don't have to search only for wage and salary employment. You can search for self-employment. It's an important issue, and it's an important option, particularly for older workers. It's not been widely adopted. There are various problems, but I just note that it's ironic that the federal unemployment insurance program says self-employment assistance is a form of unemployment insurance, and you can use it to help people get jobs, but when they get those jobs, if they lose them, they can't collect UI. Independent contractors, each state makes its own decision. We've heard about workers' comp. Each state decides who is in an employee-employer relationship. And state laws, although they generally follow IRS determinations, really vary by state, and states can make their own determinations. With respect to independent contractors, if you're a true independent contractor under unemployment insurance, there is not an employer relationship, and people would not be covered. But there is a wide variety of issues of misclassification and reclassification issues similar to other programs. The UI program, just as an example, FedEx and UPS considered their workers to be independent contractors. The courts have changed that, and those workers, drivers, are now covered. But with respect to the gig economy, we're still in an unresolved situation. California and New York have looked at, particularly at Uber and Lyft, and in fact, California has paid a few Uber workers unemployment insurance at the same time that Uber drivers are not covered and there's no tax collected from Uber in California. And that's, I think, largely because there have been no challenges that have gotten to the courts, either state or federal courts yet, although taxi drivers in New York and California are pushing to have Uber drivers to be employees. So as of now, they are not covered. Potential solutions, I think because of the nature of unemployment insurance, we're in a situation where there is going to be continued resistance in many states to expansion. we heard about workers' comp and in unemployment insurance too. Uber has been active in making sure that workers are not covered in some states. I think the issue really is to have employees fund some or most of unemployment insurance, and I think this would clearly reduce employer opposition to expansions of the program, but economists have generally found that the incidence of the unemployment insurance tax falls mostly on employees anyway, and with a tax rate of less than 1%, it would not be a great burden. So that is one way to certainly increase eligibility of workers to account for the greater labor force situation, but it also, I think outside the UI system, it would be a lot easier to have unemployment savings accounts, which could be used for non-standard work. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Andy?
Good afternoon, and congratulations to NASI for pulling such a great conference and group of speakers together today. So here's what we know about unemployment and underemployment. We know through a variety of research that non-standard earnings are more volatile than for regular workers. And that matters because most of your bills, your rent, are constant, and then when you have surprise expenses, it really is harmful not to have a steady source of income. There was some talk in the earlier panel about how gig economy might cushion recessions. In fact, the data is that recessions actually cause a bigger drop in earnings for self-employed workers because those wage employers want to keep the wages steady over a longer period of time. And in some research that we did at Century Foundation looking at the SIP, when we looked at month-to-month earnings, we found that non-standard workers, their variability, and we used a Gini coefficient, were almost twice as variable as wage and salary workers. So in the best case scenario, this is part of the trade-off, and this is what you hear in some of the surveys of non-standard workers. This volatility is a trade-off for independence, but in more of a worst-case scenario, this is a symptom of what Kallenberg calls as a more polarized workforce between good jobs and more peripheral jobs. But while we know that earnings are more volatile, unemployment is difficult to define for many non-standard workers, particularly the self-employed or freelance workers. Most importantly, when it comes to how BLS or UI might define UI, how can you determine if a freelancer is unemployed through no fault of their own? If in some ways we can say freelancers decide when they want to work. If freelancers, can they be laid off when they have clients as opposed to employers? And even other forms of non-standard workers who have multiple employers, like day laborers or gig workers or temp workers, they don't fit these traditional definitions. To help understand this, Century Foundation and the Columbia University Poverty Center are doing some research, and we started with some focus groups of about 20 workers, and it was really very interesting. Regular workers, and I've worked with unemployed workers for most of my career, see unemployment as a shock. Right, where you lose your job, either temporarily or permanently, and things really are changed. For the freelancers we talked to, they see unemployment as endemic and as part of your working. And one of the photographers that was in the focus group said, when I asked about unemployment, said, "You don't understand what I do. There's never any stability in my work." When we talked about when people had their coping strategies were intensely personal, rather than relying on social insurance, to the point that more than one freelancer said, well, in January, when I don't have very much work, I just don't leave my house, because that way I won't spend any money. Outside of Medicaid, had very limited understanding or interest really in social insurance programs. So it's very hard to define unemployment amongst freelancers and think about how to solve it. So I'm going to talk first, to this point that there's a lot of different forms of non-standard workers, how we can reform UI within the system, and then how we might think about then some reforms outside of the system. So when we think of a lot of these categories that are included in UI coverage among non-standard workers, temporary workers, contract workers are included in UI, but may not have as much unemployment as people are, but may have a little underemployment. So UI can cushion variable earnings. The UI system has a provision called partial benefits, that if your earnings drop, and they drop to a level that it's convoluted, that is less than some multiple of what you would collect if you were fully unemployed, you can get a partial unemployment check that will make up typically for about half of that earnings you lost, say if you're cut from 40 to 20 hours per week. And what we see that there's these like things in UI, there's a lot of state variation. Those states that are generous in saying who could qualify for partial benefits are covering almost 1 in 7 of all claims in their state are actually these partial claims. But in fact, most workers are not aware of this right that they have to file partial benefits. In fact, if you were working somewhere and your hours were cut from 40 to 20 hours a week, you could file a UI claim while you're still working. Most workers are not aware of it and are worried, they might be retaliated against if they were to do this. So a lot of this is just making workers more aware of their ability to claim partial benefits. I would like to see states allow for backdated filing. So all of a sudden you've seen that, hey, I used to get 30 hours a week, and for the last 8 weeks I've only gotten 20. Well, let me go ahead and file back for all those claims of weeks that you're doing, allow for easier back filing, and just making the formulas more generous. I think there's a lot of potential in partial benefits in UI. So let me just briefly talk about some other fixes to the UI system, and I'll underscore on the slide what Steve said. The first thing is to stop the rampant misclassification of workers as independent contractors who should be treated as workers and get them access to full UI. But some other groups that were talked a little bit about that, in some of the earlier presentation, there's probably about, Upwork estimates there's about 15.2 million what they call as diversified freelancers. These are people who mix regular employment and non-standard work. And this becomes a real problem if you lose that main job, if you're laid off, and you try to apply for UI benefits. Often can be fully disqualified in many states because when they say, look at you, no, you're really an entrepreneur. You're really a hairdresser, or you have a family farm. You're still working at that job, so you're considered fully employed. Or when you try to figure out your income for that week for some partial benefits, it's very hard for the states to help you figure it out. So that's the area we have to work on. And then lastly, temporary help agency workers face special disqualifications, really discriminated against. When a temporary job ends, you're really laid off. You have no work. But many states still have a rule that if you don't call in looking for another temp job, even though if it's inferior or not even in your line of work, you can be disqualified, and they'll tell you that you were voluntarily quitting your job by not calling back in. So let me just talk about, this question that Steve raised. Could we expand UI, not just down to those workers that are not eligible for UI today? And in fact, the biggest hole in UI coverage in terms of workers who don't have any access is the self-employed. So one way to solve that, we have voluntary UI. And so in my research, there are a few of the Nordic countries that provide this. And Denmark has a pretty simple definition to get UI. It's not ideal, I think, but it's simple, that if you're self-employed, you can pay in, and if you shut down your self-employed business, then you can collect UI, and at that point, you have to look for work, like anyone else collecting UI. And then, I think, and there's many registered, professions, how many licenses that we have now. In that case, you have to actually, deregister your business. So that's a simple solution. I don't think it's ideal because I think a lot of what we're looking for is freelance workers who may want to continue their business, even after a period of hard times or losing some clients. In fact, that's provided for in the Finnish system where you can actually get partial benefits if you only partially shut down your freelancing business. in the paper that we propose a kind of pilot program. We have to try this more in the U.S., and I think there's a way to combine these two aspects that we talk about: some access to UI coverage, and then this idea of a self-employment assistance or entrepreneurial assistance plan. This is, for freelancers who are struggling, have lost income for a period of time because lost clients, we should be kind of helping them get back on their feet, improve their business network, and ways to find new clients. So then just let me briefly talk about some solutions outside of UI, because like Steve, I think there are some limits to what UI can do. I think we're going to hear later from Althea Erickson, who I thought posed a really good idea, was to make the earned income tax credit a quarterly program versus an annual program. So some way to say this is a way that we can get workers some additional income that they might lose, for example, if they go from a good year to a bad year and then qualify for a greater earned income tax credit, but get it to them in a more advanced way there. Obviously, people talk about portable benefits as a way of paying into UI. And then I think more broadly, I think when I've these focus groups and talking with some of the groups represented today and otherwise, for non-standard workers don't even have that very basic ability if they need to mix 1 or 2 or 3 days of work. And it kind of all blends together, I think, for them. So having some program where non-standard workers, through portable benefits or through a savings account, could earn just a little bit of earned leave or paid leave to get through at least some of the problems of unemployment. Thanks so much.
Now we have Rachel.
Thanks so much for having me here. So I want to pick up where Andy left off and focus on some sort of creative, big think, non-UI related options. But first I want to briefly emphasize, as both Andy and Steve did, that there are fixes within UI that won't address the full problem, but they can take us a long way toward addressing unemployment risks, even for non-standard workers. And then secondly, and I think importantly for low-income non-standard workers in particular, sort of give the lay of the land and the interaction of the various other programs that could help them cope with unemployment risk. So to begin, all of this kind of is informed by some joint work that my organization CAP did with Indy's organization at Georgetown and the National Employment Law Project as well. So other folks have already covered the fact that there are multiple more marginal ways that we could better integrate non-standard workers of various types into the UI system. And the first and foremost thing that I would say is preventing worker misclass, as the other two presenters emphasized. And then also there's a lot of hope for reforming the partial UI system, as Andy talked about. There are a lot of other things you can take a look at. NELP's work on this in particular, and also new paper out today from the Aspen Institute that go through those various ways to reform UI in order to better incorporate these workers. But we know that even if all states were to do that, there would still be a lot of workers left uncovered, particularly independent contractors. Unfortunately, states are going in the opposite direction, or have since the Great Recession. Steve talked about how a lot of them have cut down their UI programs. They've reduced benefits, they've shortened weeks, they've tightened their eligibility criteria so that now we only have 1 in 4 unemployed workers receiving UI, which is a historic low. And that underserves, of course, workers of color, women, low-wage workers, young workers, and definitely non-standard workers. UI isn't the only vehicle, of course, that we should have for protecting workers from unemployment and underemployment risk, but it's also been a trend that the rest of the programs that serve, in particular, low-income working families have sort of been diminished. And now one of our largest anti-poverty programs, the Earned Income Tax Credit, there are ways to reform it to make it more useful for income smoothing, but nonetheless, it is dependent on having earnings, being able to find a job if you're a standard worker, having enough earnings if you are a non-standard worker in order to get a substantial credit. SNAP has significant restrictions, particularly for single workers, even though it's supposed to be available to everyone. That's the food stamp program. And TANF is basically just cash assistance is a shadow of its former self. My boss, Melissa, has done a lot of work on how, as has Indy, the block grant has decreased by 1/3, and so it is really not available to anybody but very poor families with children, and even then it's only 1 in 4 poor families with children who are receiving TANF at this point. So there are not a lot of other options for particularly low-wage non-standard workers who face periods of unemployment or underemployment, and you couple that with the fact that we don't have paid leave standards in this country. It is not social insurance in the same way that it is in other countries. And that means that there's very little safety net for non-standard workers to offset the fact that they're largely not getting UI, or when they are getting UI, it's a very inadequate benefit. So what can be done? Andy talked about a lot of the solutions within UI, and Steve talked about self-employment assistance. I want to put out one other sort of big think idea that CAP, Georgetown, and NELP worked on, called a job seekers allowance that would both address the workers who are left out of UI, including notably independent contractors who are not eligible at all, but also work to plug some of the other gaps in our social assistance system that I just spoke about. So the target population for this job seekers allowance are independent contractors and people who are non-UI eligible by the nature of UI, but also new labor market entrants, people coming out of school who need a foot in the labor market, young workers, returning workers like people who've been caregiving for many years, people who are underemployed or intermittently, sporadically employed, and people who've exhausted UI. So this is modeled after programs in the UK and Germany and elsewhere, really in the world, but Europe is particularly good at this, having a less generous non-contributory tier of unemployment assistance for people with limited work history or who've exhausted earned benefits. So this is fairly common outside of the United States. The main pillar is just a weekly benefit of, in our formulation, $170 a week, that basically replaces half of the wages of a worker at the 10th percentile of earnings in the US. So that's very modest, but it's not nothing, and it's comparable to the monetary equivalent of what a family would get in SNAP for a month. So that's available for up to 13 weeks for most workers, with some exceptions like domestic violence or during recessions. That period would be automatically lengthened in our envisioning. It also connects workers to services, so reemployment services that we've talked about as being so important for workers getting back into the labor market and staying attached, but also skills training and job opportunities. Unlike UI, though, it's not calculated on the basis of hours or earnings, and it doesn't require prior employment or earnings. So eligibility criteria would be pretty simple. You must meet an age threshold, first of all, so you must be 19 or have a high school degree or a GED, the equivalent, whichever comes first. But like UI, it would have job search requirements. You must be actively seeking work, and a pretty non-stringent means test if your household is below the Social Security maximum payroll tax cap, so about $130,000 per year. Would have a rolling time limit of 52 weeks over a 5-year period that would control costs and misuse, again, with some exceptions. And because one thing that we want this program to do is plug some really gaping holes in the way that our economic security system addresses barriers to work, this would have 2 separate paths. So the first that almost all of the workers in our research would be routed down would be very simple, just unemployment assistance, connection to local job opportunities, connection to skills assessment assessment and reemployment services. The second path, though, is more intensive for folks with barriers to work, like a criminal record or like a substance abuse problem, and that would connect, really provide a gateway into wraparound services and more intensive employment assistance in order to address those barriers. It would cost about $11 billion a year in decent economic times like we saw in 2014, 2015, and would serve, in our estimation, about 5.4 million workers per year. Not all of them would take up on all 13 weeks, of course, but like UI, there would be sort of variation there. Would have many of the same benefits that UI has that it now only gives to those 1 in 4 unemployed workers that it serves, but key among them are providing insurance, of course, against the risk of unemployment or underemployment, stabilizing incomes for folks who aren't eligible for UI, including non-standard workers, raising labor force participation, which among economists has been a big worry of late. There's a secular decline in LFP. And then particularly for folks with limited resources and barriers to work, which includes a lot of the non-standard workers who are on-call workers or temp agency workers in particular, promoting successful reemployment by connecting folks and keeping them connected to the labor force, connecting them to serving as a gateway to the workforce system, and then improving the matching between firms and workers. And one way that UI does this, and what we also envision for the job seekers allowance, is that it gives a small financial cushion to workers so that they can hold out for a better job. And one additional benefit that this has macroeconomically is for low-wage labor markets to raise wages and quality of work at the very bottom if you have just a little bit of an alternative to not be forced into that really cruddy, often non-standard job. So multiple benefits similar to UI. Then the thing that I think is of interest to the group of folks who've been thinking about portable benefits is that this could serve as a platform for a more expansive, perhaps contributory or partially contributory and more generous, adequate system in which independent contractors, for example, who have longer work histories, could get a tiered, more adequate benefit. And it could, in fact, become a platform for other forms of social assistance for those folks as well. So I think I will stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. And I think one last shot for folks to write down questions. Alexander will go around the room collecting them. I'm going to ask one to start off with. I think one way to think about the sort of terrific ideas you all raised here is thinking about sort of two strategies. One is essentially voluntary or compulsory savings, and one is sort of socializing these risks. And I think about the voluntary or compulsory savings as potentially addressing problems of sort of myopia, of sort of just life cycle sort of changes and whatnot, and the socializing risks sort of suggest there's more of a problem of insufficient earnings, potentially extreme shocks and risks and costs. And so I wonder, Stephen, if you could start us with sort of thinking about when do you think about which strategy, especially in the context of non-standard workers, and for whom, and in the context of sort of savings schemes, when would voluntary schemes work, if at all? You mentioned California as an example, and other states couldn't sort of work anything out. So please, go ahead. And we'll go down the row afterwards.
Well, I guess what I was trying to distinguish between was extending eligibility to individuals outside the system, but definitely for non-standard workers, I find it difficult to see how the unemployment insurance system as a social insurance system could deal with non-standard workers. So what I can conceive of is enacting a program that's Voluntary, I'm not sure under what circumstances you could have a mandatory system. But clearly, an unemployment savings account that could be used only for unemployment insurance purposes, for unemployment purposes, seems to me to make sense.
And thank you, Stephen.
I guess I would say I would see a distinguishing that for many non-standard workers, they can kind of anticipate a certain amount of variation, seasonal or just the regular variation they can expect. That's probably something that probably needs to be addressed through savings or some type of kind of paid leave program. Whereas it's those bigger shocks of multiple months or longer without having any work, because your client base is dried up or you lose a major client, that we need some type of social insurance for.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think it would be very difficult, particularly for low and middle income freelancers and other non-standard workers to build up enough of a cushion to really insure against large risk, like losing your job entirely rather than just a seasonal hours reduction. And I think when we get to the next recession is where the test will be of whether, it's always unemployment that's a problem for non-standard workers, or whether there really is, even for gig economy workers, are there layoffs in the same sense that there have been in standard work. And that is something that I think it's very difficult to envision each individual worker building up enough of a cushion to deal with when the average, UI payout is $4,000 to $6,000 for an unemployment spell or so.
Great, thank you. So we have a question from the audience. I think this is primarily for you, Rachel. So please explain more how the lack of paid leave is both a cause and consequence of non-standard work participation, although others should jump in.
Sure. Yeah, I skipped over that a little bit. So it's a cause in the sense that for many types of non-standard work that aren't voluntary, and I think a presenter earlier said that we find in the 2005 contingent worker survey that about 45% of non-standard work is not voluntary, and that's largely concentrated in low income women and workers of color, that for those folks, they may be taking a non-standard job because they have caretaking duties, or they have a relative who is disabled or a disability themselves. There are all kinds of reasons that someone might need to take time off of work or might need a flexible schedule, but can't get a job that has enough or good enough paid leave to do that. So they are effectively, their need for leave or flexible schedules causing their non-standard work. I think it's also that there are ways in which it is so that's a way in which it's a result of non-standard work.
Great. Anyone want to add anything?
I would add that when the efforts to construct paid leave programs to fit in non-standard workers, I think there's been some efforts to it, but it also shows how long we have to go. Most of our social insurance systems first look at freelancers as business owners, and then treat them as business owners in their social insurance systems, which is makes it incredibly hard to access coverage. So I think we got to change that. I don't support the dependent workers concept, but I think we should be moving to treat the freelancers as workers for these systems.
Do you want to add anything?
Well, I think it's worthwhile to, particularly if you're thinking of a major recession again, that unemployment insurance doesn't work in a Great Recession either. It's a 6-month program, and what has evolved over time is a federally funded extension program. We've had 2 extension programs in most recessions since then. I think the same issue would clearly be an issue for non-standard workers. Even if you did have unemployment savings accounts, for young workers, they're not going to last very long. It's not going to be very effective. You probably need general revenue programs. And it's also to realize that we probably we should have learned more from the Great Recession than we have. I mean, a number of us are working on a study of SNAP and UI and what happened to unemployed workers during the Great Recession. A surprising number of individuals used up all of their benefits, the regular program, extended benefits, emergency unemployment compensation, and went on to the SNAP program. So a social insurance program as such seems to end after 6 months for most workers for whatever we would do short of an unemployment assistance program, which Rachel is proposing. You'd have to have the same thing for non-standard workers as well.
Great. We have a couple more questions from the audience. This one, I think, for Rachel. Again, for the job seekers allowance, what are the job search requirements for independent contractors?
Right, so we haven't fully, I don't think we fully spell that out in the proposal and leave it a little bit open, but I think ideally what you'd want to do with both UI and with the job seekers allowances is, as Andy mentioned for UI, moving away from or as Steve mentioned, I think moving away from the requirement that it be that it fully operate around standard full-time work. So independent contractors who are unemployed and searching for work, they should be able to also search for self-employment opportunities, for example. But like UI, each state does this differently, and it would be ideal if it were more federally standardized, but there are specific rules in each state around what the job search requirements are for applying to work and looking for work opportunities, checking in with folks at the UI office and so on, and that would apply to the job seekers allowance as well as UI.
Great.
One tack for that would be to flip the ways in which people collecting UI get disqualified for having a business, right? They look at whether you have a website, whether you're actively seeking clients, whether you've filed your self-employment taxes. So I think looking at some of these things, if you're actively operating as a freelancer and looking for new work, would be one way to solve this. And we, in talking with the freelancers union we're working with, you could also have an intermediary that helped to play that role. That would be the equivalent of a job club for self-employed workers, help with networking and finding new clients. So you could have it both be a more passive way, but also a more active assistance.
Great, and I think this will be our last audience question. What are the implications of restricting savings to be used only for periods of unemployment for low-income families that are likely to experience other unexpected expenses in health, housing, transportation, et cetera? Does anyone want to start us off on that one?
So yeah, my perspective on that is that I would like to see something that would be more flexible. And I think in talking with workers in these low-wage freelance workers and their advocates, I think that's what they're more looking for, rather than a separate payment for disability, a separate thing for paid leave, a separate unemployment. We need something that's probably more flexible to deal with this idea of savings.
I would take issue with that a little bit to the extent that there are indeed specialized shocks still, like disability and like pure unemployment, that are very costly. And I think that the social insurance model has been really valuable in pooling a potentially large amount of resources that we know will only need to go to a few folks, but we don't know who those folks are in advance. However, I think that that for general purposes, Andy's advance EITC work on a quarterly payment that frees up just liquidity for transportation costs, for childcare costs, for whatever the family is facing at that time, with money that they've effectively already earned, is a great sort of complement to the social insurance provided by UI, by DI, and so on. And CAP has also done some work on advanced EITC. Hopefully we can get that in the political bloodstream as well.
Great, well, terrific. And thanks to our panel, first of all. So thank you again. Thanks for the questions. You know, I've always wondered, do people ask questions to hear their own voice? And apparently mostly yes, since we only got 2 this time, but terrific questions. I just have a couple of announcements. So you have your evaluation form in the folder. You've been hearing this after each session. You want to fill that out. We're going to have a break now, about 40 minutes, 35 minutes, either till 12:45. And there's going to be a lunch and keynote on Social Security. The lunch buffet is open in the east wing of the ballroom, which is to your right as you look at the stage. So if you could grab food and return to your seats, we'll begin promptly at 12:45. We have now coffee and desserts, so the desserts are new, including apparently famous Press Club brownies, in the networking lounge, right? All right, so thank you. Yeah, I can. No, yeah. Okay, all right.